Thank you everyone for joining us today for holding space to discuss a complicated past. I am going to go over a few technical items before we get into today's webinar. We do have live closed captioning provided. It is enabled and you should be able to access that by clicking on the icon with the 3 dots and then selecting closed caption. All attendees are muted, but we do welcome your questions and comments in the chat at any time. Please be sure to select everyone from the drop-down menu when posting your questions and comments in chat to ensure that everyone sees them. You can go ahead and post in chat right now, letting us know where you're joining us from today and maybe how the weather is there. If you do have questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A function to post them. That way Miles and I will queue them up and ask them up to our speakers at the end. If you need technical support, use the Q&A function for that as well. Sometimes chat moves very quickly and that makes sure that we can see it and address your needs. We are recording today's session and we will be posting it on our YouTube channel in about a week. At that time, everyone who registered will receive an email from us with the link for the recording. Just as a reminder, by registering for this webinar today, all attendees have agreed to abide by the NNLM Code of Conduct to foster a respectful and professional learning environment, and you received a link to that in your registration email. This class is eligible for CE from the Medical Library Association, and you will be able to claim that evaluation link and enrollment code at the end of this session. You will also receive an email with it with the recording. So if you don't grab it today, don't worry, you'll get it in an email. And speaking of that, your feedback does matter to us and helps us improve future training. So please take a few moments to complete the feedback form, even if you don't want or need CE. A quick word about who we are. NLM, the National Library of Medicine, is one of the 27 institutes and offices at the National Institutes of Health. It is the world's largest biomedical library and produces online resources such as PubMed and Medline Plus. NNLM, or the Network of the National Library of Medicine, is an outreach program of NLM, and it works to ensure health professionals, librarians, and the public have equal access to health information. NNLM is made up of 7 regional medical libraries, 3 national offices, 4 national centers, all of which provide training, funding, and engagement opportunities to our member organizations. Today's session is organized by Region 6 of our Spotlight Seeker series. Region 6 includes the states of Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin. Our webinars are open to everyone, and if you'd like to connect with your regional office or learn more, you can check out our website at nlm.gov. I am Bobby Newman. I'm your host for today, and my pronouns are she and her. I am the Community Engagement and Outreach Specialist for Region 6 of NNLM at the University of Iowa Libraries. My colleague, Miles Dietz-Castell, the Region 6 Communications and Finance Coordinator, is here with me today, and we'll be keeping an eye on chat together and gather your questions to share with our presenters at the end of the session. With that, I'm going to introduce our speakers. Nicolette is an assistant librarian for social work, kinesiology, and health sciences at Louisiana State University and based in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. In 2023, the American Library Association selected her as an emerging leader, and her interests include critical librarianship, BIPOC community building, community engagement, and person-centered practices at LIS. Patrice is the curator for African American and African diaspora collections at Harvard Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. In 2022, she was selected as an Andrew W. Mellon Fellow for Diversity, Inclusion, and Cultural Heritage at the Rare Book School. She holds a master's degree in public history and library and information science from the University of South Carolina, with training focused on museum and material culture, historic preservation, and archives and preservation management. Her interests include archival representation, knowledge justice, and Black history and culture. Additionally, her work allowed her to develop and steward collections that center Black life, enhance teaching and learning experiences, and cultivate Black memory. Raymond is the academic and research librarian at the Alder Graduate School of Education and a teacher residency program in California. In this role, he provides research support to graduate students, service teachers, and teacher educators. Ray is a faculty member in the MA Pathway program at Alder GSE. In addition, he is an active member in library associations such as the Librarians, Archives, and Museum Professionals in the History of the Health Sciences. With that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to our speakers today.
Great. Thank you so much, Bobby and Miles and our captioner for supporting the session for today. I'm so thrilled to be here with all of you and my co-presenters, Nicolette and Patrice. We're really excited that all of you are able to join us today on a Friday morning, afternoon, or wherever you may be. I appreciate the time that you're making for us today to talk about this important topic. And so we're going to dive into this in just a second because we have a few things we really want to start off, and really appreciate the NNLM Region 6 for this invitation. And so hopefully there will be some important conversations that you'll have here, as well as what you'll take back in your workplaces, in your professional associations, because I see many friends, not necessarily in health or medical libraries, but throughout different other areas I've come across over the years in the profession. And so hopefully there'll be some really great conversations that you'll take back. So now I'll pass it over to Nicolette.
Okay, thank you so much, Ray. I see Bobby kind of got us started with asking where you all are located in the chat. So thank you all for sharing from where you are in the United States or beyond. So if anyone else would like to share where they are, please do so in the chat. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and so we've already had our introductions. I would just say that my pronouns are she and her. Thank you, Bobby, for the introductions. Would anyone else like to add on to what Bobby has already provided? Ray or Patrice?
Yeah, I'll just say that my pronouns are also she and her. I know it says it on the screen, but just speaking for purposes in case anyone is only using the audio content.
Yes, thank you, Nicolette. And my pronouns are he and him. And I also want to share that this is a really important topic, one that I think hopefully people will take back. It's something that I've been personally thinking about for quite a while, even since library school over a decade ago. And so I'm glad that we have a chance to surface this into an opportunity for discussion.
Awesome. Thank y'all. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so before we get started today, we would like to take some time to share and highlight two specific communities. This week is Transgender Awareness Week, which is about uplifting the voices and experiences of trans folks who are often silenced. Trans folks in the US and beyond face harsh prejudices, systemic discrimination, and violence on a daily basis. And in fact, on November 20th, we take the day to remember the lives that have been lost due to anti-trans violence. And that is Transgender Day of Remembrance. Being aware, however, does not equal action. It doesn't enact change. So we encourage our attendees to take the time to put forth some meaningful action for positive change by supporting, uplifting, and being accomplices to our trans colleagues this week, next week, and all the weeks to come, year round. Okay, next slide, please. It is also, today is the International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day. Suicide prevention is multifaceted. It includes, but is not limited to, the 988 Lifeline, accessible healthcare, livable wages, adequate and affordable housing, clean water, and safe communities. Today, remember the lives lost due to suicide and the survivors who are here to cherish their memories.
Thank you, Nicolette. So I'll take over here. Wanted to share that we dedicate this presentation to the following people: Henrietta Lacks, Lucy Zimmerman, Anarcha Westcott, Betsy Harris, and many other Black, Indigenous, and people of color whose bodies have been used to support and advance medical research at their expense without their consent or acknowledgement. We share this dedication because we know that for the advancement of medicine, it has come at the expense of people of color, Black, Indigenous folks, And this is something that we'll be highlighting in the presentation that's coming in from the publication that came out a couple of months ago that we'll talk about. And we think that this is really critical because it ties connectly to the practices of eugenics, genocide, imperialism, and colonialism that happens in the land in the United States. So first, why this topic? That's what we'll dive into a little bit here to give you some context, how it sort of got started and some sort of way of framing this conversation. And then we'll move on into medical libraries and past roles very briefly, because certainly there's that article that we mentioned that we'll drop the link and that you can take a look at it later. And this is just really our perspective. Of course, there are so many other ones that could be included as well that you might encounter in your literature reviews later. And then we'll get into critical librarianship in addressing medical racism, ways to interrogate the systemic issues that continue to endure in medical health sciences librarianship, as well as in general, how you can apply them in your instructional practices. And then finally, we'll move on to questions and discussions. We don't want to say we are like the experts, we have all the answers. That's not really the purpose, but rather that we're here to facilitate a conversation. This is something that's really difficult and certainly something that if we look at it from a macro point of view in the United States, it's something that is still grappling the trauma of slavery, of racism, and genocide and colonialism and so forth, right? And so we want to honor and have space to have these conversations because it's important, and also it helps us to ensure that we can work together collectively to raise awareness and to improve our profession in general. So first, as I mentioned, there was a commentary that came out in July of 2023 this year, published by the Journal of Medical Libraries Association, known as JMLA, under the Medical Library Association. And we thank our co-editors and those who've been involved in facilitating this process. And this article is an open access publication that you can find in the chat box that I'm going to drop it here in the link. The idea is that medical libraries, like any institutions, have really deep, complicated pasts. And it's an exploration of the historical connections between medical collections and racial science. And what we found very briefly here in a nutshell is that there are instances in American history that have documented the institutional practices and compliances or complicities of upholding racial science. Of course, using contemporary lens, that's what we are able to really analyze. And if we look back, those were common practices to think of how Black bodies could be used and taken to create medical knowledge that then turns into a form of article or publication in a trade publication or in a medical journal, and then that's being collected and stewarded by library workers at that time. And also the idea of accessing that information, that's also a separate issue, but also connected. Who has access to that information? Certainly a certain group of privileged folks, right? A certain demographic has had opportunities to access that information at the expense of other people who might not necessarily have had the opportunity to even go and become part of the profession, let's say. And so we want to also argue that libraries are not neutral. I think that's something that's been in the discourse for a while, but certainly a lot of people have viewed it as, for generations, right? Certainly that it is a place that does not take a stance or does not have any sort of position on these issues, but rather, if we look at history, we're going to begin to see, like any other institution, any other aspect of that there are going to be problematic issues, right, that surfaces. And so we encourage you to take a look at this. I think there are important aspects to consider and think about, and we look forward to your comments. So that's sort of the summary of this publication. And so why this topic? So you see an image here. This is actually a picture that I took back in May of 2018 when I was at the New York Academy of Medicine in New York. I was visiting at the time. I'm originally from New York, but at the time I was working in another university in California. And then I had been thinking about this topic for quite a while. And then I said, oh, I need to make an appointment. I put all my holds together and they were so efficient. I give a shout out to Ann Garner and Arlene, the people who were working there at the time, just like giving me access to all this historical documents that helped me understand the connection of colonialism and libraries. Like I was trying to understand how were libraries sites of colonialism in history, right? And then I found some other instances, which we did not include in the article, which I'm happy to share here openly, that there were examples of the Belgian Empire, right, and the Congo, and then they had created libraries to start knowledge management work, how to describe people in certain aspects biologically, how to collect plants and the ecology, right? So all that's connected. And it's because of the library being that instrument, that mediator to facilitate the knowledge and access, and also to create that epistemology, how we understand what we know based on these developments. It gave me a lot of ideas to think about, and one that I really started thinking we should focus on like medical issues, because there's something about medicine, history of medicine. And I will want to admit here, I am not a historian of medicine. I am not a medical or health science librarian, but I am a student of history and someone who takes historiography and the importance of repatriation or really seriously. And it's something that sparked my interest in working on this article and collaborating with others to highlight this issue. Now, keep in mind, this was 2018. Certainly, there were some discussions that were happening in the medical field, which we'll talk about. But something else recently happened that was more interesting, or not more interesting, but rather that complemented what was going on, that was sort of framing this conversation happening. This is before the pandemic, right? So a lot has happened since. And now I'll pass it over to Patrice to highlight some of these issues.
Yes, thank you. So we have a couple of, can everybody hear me okay? I've been doing some finagling. We have a couple of instances where people are either discovering or reminded of the fact that institutions can be very insidious in their practices, or in their past practices at least. And those practices are finally catching up with a lot of these places in really meaningful ways when it comes to things like donors and funding, and the ideas of social justice, things like that. So one of the biggest stories, of course, is out of the Smithsonian. There's the Racial Brain Collection, and their idea was they have these archaeologists, anthropologists, and this is kind of a story that goes along with most of these older institutions. Someone figured out, hey, they have a lot of, skulls here in the collection. Who do they belong to? Where do they come from? And they were all or mostly collected by like one person down in South America, rather than interning the bodies or the people where they lived. They were brought back to the States to study as kind of this spectacle, and to compare them to the skulls of white people, to reinforce ideas about eugenics and the ideas of white supremacy. We see similar things happening here at Harvard University, where I am, and Nicole will get more into grave robbing and that kind of thing. So just a warning, if you're not into that, maybe the rest of this lecture or this talk today isn't for you. But other instances, we have the Muter Museum in Pennsylvania, in Philly. They are famous for their macabre collections, and they have all of these different bodies preserved, these different body parts, brains, all of these different things. And they wanted to know, there was this, I think they were undergoing reinterpretation. So they tried to figure out what was the best way to go about that. And people got upset, and by people, I mean people who love the Muter Museum, were upset because of the fact that they were like, the point of the Muter Museum is for it to be this weird and cool and disturbing place. And it's like, that's not the point of these things. Do we know where these bodies came from? A lot of the times they don't, for men or male bodies who are described as like baby giants, people who have dwarfism or any other medical differences. Their bodies are kept there and they're kind of held hostage in a way. And when we try to discuss those things, there are the people like, well, it's just cool stuff. It's like, no, those are people's bodies. Those were their lives. And it's under the guise of studying these kinds of medical issues. And it's like, yes, but you still have to have consent. Even today, when you pass away, you have to decide whether or not to give your organs away. You have that kind of bodily autonomy. So those are some of the issues. And then we go into things like the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia, where the bones from that horrible, horrible incident were held at Penn. And we have all of these other issues where people's bones, usually people who are Black and Indigenous and people of color, they are held in these different spaces so they can be ogled and studied for the advancement of science and medicine, which how much advancement do you need? And then once we start talking in good critical faith about things like disability and race and ethnicity and difference, then we have to ask ourselves, who do we actually believe about their health? So this bleeds over these perceptions that we get from studying all these different bodies, where they came from, they bleed over into modern medicine. And we still have a lot of issues about people saying Black people have really thick skin so they don't need as much painkillers and all that other stuff, which I do not have time for this day. I don't want to have a stroke. So we just have to really consider what this kind of misuse of medical collections is really going to, how it's going to educate us in a way. Okay, next slide.
Oh, sorry, that article just popped up. So let me move it back. Okay. Let's see if I can move this. Okay, great. Thank you for that, Patrice. So let's talk about some of the issues that you expanded upon, which is looking at the idea of racial science. And for those who are not familiar with it, racial science is a pseudoscience belief that defines and categorizes people in a hierarchy based on race. Now, these are medical history books that just came out not too long ago. And I see Tawana Hodge. Thank you, Tawana, for dropping some of the links on some of these books, as well as some other titles. So there is a relationship that we are arguing and framing between medical libraries and racial science. And some of the stuff that Patrice mentioned certainly comes into the GLAM space, museums and archives, which is all interconnected to how knowledge and access is framed and understood. And we should also mention that in addition to this issue, that there are agendas that were found in Europe. So these are all mostly within the United States and as well as the British Empire. But in other parts in Europe, for instance, like Nazi Germany, where Nazi scientists really adapted the idea of eugenics, racial superiority from the United States and started planning their own agenda, borrowing those ideas because of looking at the hierarchy and the formation of slavery as an institution, and then how they're treating Jewish people and Jewish bodies. And of course, there is this renowned anatomy book, such as Edward Pernkopf's Topographic Anatomy of Man in 1933, which contained anatomical drawings that were based on the bodies of executed prisoners by Nazis. The important thing to note is that this textbook was studied, collected, and shared within the spaces of medical schools and libraries, right? And so even today, because of its sort of depiction, or rather its information that was contained, but yet it's still having these information that derives from this experiences from the victim that has not been acknowledged. Now, with these other books you see here, the most recent one that I was fortunate to review for the Libraries and Archives in History of Health Science is the Masters of Health, Racial Science and Slavery in U.S. Medical Schools. Dr. Willoughby did a really fantastic work in analyzing the connections of that within the 19th and 20th century and looking at the implications that are happening. That's some of the implications that Patrice alluded to earlier. Medical Bondage by Dr. Cooper Owens is looking at the history of gynecology and the gynecologist who sort of created it, known as Dr. Simmons at times, and who unfortunately tested without anesthesia and without consent of many African and African-American women to perfect his technique and without acknowledging them. And so there's been a lot of discussions to rectify that information and rectify his character in a way that brings light to the people who actually and unwillfully and willfully submitted to it to ensure that the medical science advanced, but at the expense of their bodies. And of course, some of these other ones related to medical apartheid by Dr. Washington is also a critical component to understand the ideas of medical science, medical experimentation on Black Americans that we had alluded to some of the issues that Henrietta Lacks and so forth, and how it really is that dark side that people do not want to talk about. Now, framing it for library history and library science, we're opening this as a conversation, okay? And it's something that's much needed, and I think it's really, really timely to have these conversations, as Patrice shared, with the different types of issues that are going on that are being discovered or unearthed, right? With air quotes I have. And so with that being said, I think there are a lot of really great resources that people can really look at and consider, because it helps us understand this issue in a broader context and how libraries are complicit in supporting these kinds of unfortunate practices that were happening. Now, I also want to highlight this book by Dr. Moore, Slavery and the Making of Early American Libraries, British Literature, Political Thought, and the Transatlantic Book Trade. Now, in this monograph, briefly here, Dr. Moore really makes the intentional connection of early colonial libraries in America and how slaves were part of that in building and constructing. So you're thinking about some of the libraries in the Northeast and how it is built by the labor of slaves. And so with that being said, it helps us frame that even within libraries in colonial America, these are not necessarily medical libraries. It is still suggests and implies that there is some rooted and connected implication of how African Americans were part of building the foundation of libraries, but through this institution of slavery. And now we want to highlight this aspect, this quote that we have in our article as well, that medical libraries perpetuate medical racism based on past and current collection practices and at the expense of Black and Indigenous people. Now, we say this and current because there is some ramification that's happening, certainly some issues that Patrice alluded to, but it's also important to note that the libraries that are doing this, certainly we mentioned medical libraries, but historically were either public to a certain extent as a university in that context, or as private libraries. We're counting private libraries as part of it because that's how they sort of started off as a private collection, as physicians collected collections and built libraries, but not necessarily having that training or foundation because it was sort of in development at the time. So that's something to keep in mind, that this is our sort of framing for this conversation, and we'd love to hear some thoughts later about it. And from here, I'll pass it over to Nicolette.
Okay, next slide for me. I think this was your slide, Ray.
Oh, well, I will just say this briefly then. I just want to say that the exploitations and abuses in history of medical history to advance science, I mentioned the Edward Pernkopf, the Nazi Book of Anatomy, the J.R. Marion Sims, and a modern gynecology. There's so many, right? The grave robbers. So we highlight some of these areas that you'll be able to find in the article to connect back into what we're trying to frame. So I'll move to the next slide.
Okay, thank you so much. So for some transparency, I started my role as a kinesiology, social work, and health sciences librarian in June of 2022. As we discuss how information is created and consumed, I think it's important for me to share my position because I'm still relatively new to the health sciences field. As Ray said earlier, mentioned earlier, I'm not all knowing and I'm still learning and growing. So I'm just drawing from my own experiences and my own research. So as Ray and Patrice have talked about, they've shared some of the horrifying history that has influenced medical science. It's also caused harm, and as the quote said, it continues to cause harm today. A lot of these things are still being cited, and some people will even say you don't have a good library collection if you don't have some of these landmark studies or these landmark books that reinforce this racial science. So I'm a person who is unfortunately chronically online, and I'm always on TikTok and Instagram. And with the pandemic, we got a lot of misinformation related to COVID. Patrice mentioned this earlier about the darker skin being thicker, or there were some nurses online on Instagram and TikTok saying when they were given the vaccine, they could feel that the darker skinned folks, they had thicker skin. And so there's this TikToker who is also a medical school student. His name is Joel Burvell. And he makes videos about medical history and also dispelling myths about medical history. A lot of the nurses were citing these books and using their credentials and saying things such as a nurse, this is what is happening. And so using their credentials to even further make these harmful claims about people. In one of Burvell's videos, he mentions the 2016 article, which is called Racial Bias in Pain Assessment and Treatment Recommendations and False Beliefs About Biological Differences Between Blacks and Whites. And in this article, they survey medical students and residents, and a lot of these students and residents believed a lot of this misinformation about Black bodies. And in turn, this informed how they treated those patients. So, like, Black bodies seem to be tougher or seem to be more strong and can tolerate more pain. So they weren't administering as much pain medicine as they would a white body. So these things continue to be upheld today. Even in our textbooks or books in general related to medical science, Black stories, Black bodies, darker skin tones are often missing from even the critical medical literature. And so that continues to marginalize Black bodies. Additionally, the medical field is predominantly white. They still rely on outdated materials, usually because it's something that they're comfortable with. It's something that they used when they were in medical school, or their mentor has this in their collection, and that's what they're informed by. When I graduated from library school in 2018, I didn't take any kind of specific collection development class. And in the classes that I took, there was some information about collection development, but it wasn't critical, and it wasn't extensive. So outside of the basic collection development suggestions about weeding and certain parameters, and developing a collection for your community, there wasn't a lot of information that was given. Everything else was learned on the job. And you don't know what you don't know. So it's taken some time and some research for me to learn these things. And I think this is also something that library schools need to implement. There's a common argument that a lot of the things taught in library school, it's not really applicable on the job. And I think this is something that is so important to discuss with library school students about being critical about your collections. When I'm asked to teach in classes, I'm not often asked to talk about these things. I'm asked to teach about citations or databases or How do you locate a book in the collection? But I really try to use whatever little time that I have to address these things, such as health research illiteracy, misinformation and disinformation, and also just how to be critical and think more about your sources. And when students browse the collection, students or faculty, they browse the collection, it's an overwhelming amount of white-centered materials. So it can be overwhelming for the students to see. Okay. And I'll get more into some solutions a little bit later. And so I'm going to pass it off to, I think, Patrice is next.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Nicolette. That makes me think of the newer textbooks that have diagrams, but for Black people or darker skinned people, it's like, how did medical students know what it looks like? If I get a bruise and a bruise is like a cause of something or a symptom of something, you can't see bruises on me, so I don't know what to tell you. You just have to believe me when I say that I'm in pain, right? So those are some of the things I think about all the time when I go, it's like, you have chicken pox, we can't see them. It's like, well, I still have them, you just have to believe me. So I work in special collections, and I've worked in special collections librarianship my whole career. And my positionality is that I have an interest in the history of science, slightly related. I was a space camp counselor in another life, and I learned some things about Nazi Germany, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And the way the storytelling at space camp in Huntsville, Alabama, they didn't really highlight that a whole lot, as you can see. And then I went to the University of South Carolina, whose history department holds the Ann Johnson Institute for the History of Science and Technology, I believe it's called. So several reading groups, talking to different doctors, talking to other historians of science, and really thinking about how we think through history and science and medicine. So a lot of what we see come into special collections is based around spectacle for the common good, so that we can advance science or any kind of medical schedule, I guess. There's better ways to say that. And then I think a lot about donors. There are people who do donate their bodies to science, but that wasn't always the case. Of course, Nicolette and Ray talked about people who robbed graves. There was like a whole thing here at Harvard where it's like, if you wanted a cadaver, you had to go find it. Like, there wasn't really much provision on that end. So lots of grave digging. And also, to clarify something I said earlier about the brain collection. The brain collection was at the Smithsonian Skull Collection at, I want to say, Penn, but everybody has brain and skull collections. So please look at those when you have a chance. And then I think about the bodies stolen in life and death. So people enslaved, their bodies experimented on, or people who are given placebos and saying they're being healed when they're really not, which was the case in the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. Where so many of these Black men were told, hey, we're going to give you something to help you feel better, when really they were just being given a placebo, and they end up dying and they still have syphilis, and their families don't know why, and they're not told. There are ethical issues when we consider special collections. There are smoking guns. Like, how do we talk about older abortion clinics, right? If they have records, what do we do with those in the world of archives? And we had this kind of case come up recently here at the Radcliffe Institute. We do history of women in America here. And it's like, do we take this collection? Do we provide access to this collection? There are things in this collection from like the 60s and 70s and 80s. These women are still walking around right now. And we don't know the statute of limitations on things like abortion, if people will get in trouble, if people will get arrested. So we have to be careful. There are smoking guns in all kinds of archival collections. Corporate archivists can tell you more about that, but that is kind of my position on it. And then what we do as a curator. So my main training is librarianship, but I'm also a curator here. And I think a lot about cabinets of curiosity. And these are, of course, back in the day, if you found a curiosity or something to that nature, and you preserved it in a jar, bought it off a scientist or a medicine man or something, you had it in your house, you could invite your friends over to come see it, and everybody would just gawk at this medical mystery. And most cabinets of curiosity are fueled by a singular white man's joy. And that's how we get museums in general. That's how they develop. A guy somewhere said, I really like bird eggs. And the South Carolina State Museum has a collection of bird eggs. Like, that's the whole thing. And I don't know if they can do anything with them. So if you're into oology, go down there. And Jesse Lawyer wrote about this a couple of years ago in an article called Collections Are Our Relatives, Disrupting the Singular White Man's Joy That Shaped Collections. And this goes back to that spectacle. We keep these things in different spaces, and it's not really to anybody's avail, but it's just for the enjoyment of the collector. So we have to think about our collecting policies and collection development, as Nicolette mentioned earlier. Let me see. Let's go on to next slide in interest of time. So what we look at a lot is responsible stewardship. So when I'm a curator and I go to a donor's home, say they were like a Vietnam War vet, what do I do if they have a collection of body parts that they've brought back from another country as their trophies? And they're just like, I'd like to donate this. Well, it's like, no, those are human remains. You have to take those elsewhere. And these are not the primary sources teaching that we were talking about, right? We focus a lot now on teaching with primary sources, and there's an obsession with authenticity, which isn't a bad thing, but we also have to respect the bodies and the people and the lives that were lived through the letters that they leave, the bodies that they leave behind, all of these different things. So we think through responsible stewardship in galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, or GLAM institutions, as we mentioned earlier. This report from the OCLC, Total Cost of Stewardship, came out a couple of years ago, and people at institutions are really thinking about, what do we have the knowledge and capacity to care for? What do we have the authority to care for? Is our place or our right to care for these things? And how do we reflect our collection development policy so that we're not extracting things from populations where we shouldn't be? Then we have the reactionary staffing for staff like my last two jobs, who have to care for those things now that they're just like, how do we reinterpret this? And then there's the idea of cultural storytelling when it comes to these medical collections. Who are these people? Where they come from? Why do we interrupt their lives? And then how do we tell their stories later? Through medicine shows and through freak shows, sorry for the language, like American Horror Story and P.T. Barnum, who has his own specially designed section in a hill. So like there's this fetishization of non-Western medicine that also goes along with all of that. And then there are people who pretend to be Black and Indigenous people of color scholars of those materials to complicate it even a little bit more. So these are some of the things we've been having to really consider and really think about in special collections in general. And when we go back to think about medical collections, really considering why we have these, why we won't let these people rest. I think a lot of it goes back to, well, we already have it, we'll just leave it here. No, we need to set up a plan. Let's go ahead and move on. I think Ray is next.
Oh, I'll pass it over to Nicolette, actually.
Okay, thank you so much. So as far as like being critical and thinking about action items, as I said earlier, I try to always make space for critical information literacy, even if it's a small exercise. I think it gives students and faculty the tools that they need to assess their sources, authority, and determine who is missing from the research, from the literature, and who is creating this information. My personal favorite evaluation tool is the ACT UP method, but Medline also has a really good tutorial on evaluating online health information. It's kind of long. It's not as easy to remember as an acronym, but it's really helpful. Another thing that's been helpful for me is to encourage evaluation outside of the scholarship, outside of the classes. So even when you're on TikTok, like I'm always on, or you're on Instagram, Instagram or on Google. Evaluate your sources because that will carry over into your professional life and even your life as a student. I like to encourage students to explore topics that might lack white papers and discuss with the faculty the limitations of scholarly peer-reviewed sources. Because a lot of this information, sometimes it still cites harmful ideas and harmful language, and still continues to perpetuate those stereotypes about marginalized bodies. I also like to engage with community partners across campus. My school has a African American Medical Student Association, and I'm planning to reach out to them to ask, what are your needs? What are some things that you would like to see in the collection? Center those voices that are often missing. I'd also like to share a quote from our paper. When we think about how to engage our students in the classroom and in instruction sessions, it's crucial to unearth the voices and experiences of those who are often overlooked and undervalued. Similar to librarianship, the medical field continues to be a largely white profession where the status quo keeps diverse voices underrepresented in various capacities. While we are not able to change the past, vocalizing these injustices with transparency and a critical lens can serve as a means towards harm reduction in health sciences. And finally, while slow progress is being made, some texts are becoming more inclusive. We must also think about the many healthcare professionals who have been educated using these harmful materials. They're still serving as our doctors, nurses, and other practitioners. They're most likely serving in some kind of mentorship role. They may be in a position of like a director or a position of power in a healthcare setting. So this is not just a problem of the past, it's something that is continuing today. But as librarians, we do have some collective power to acknowledge what's been going on in the literature and to make changes within our collection, within our instruction, how we engage, and how we develop our resources. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is also a quote from an article by some Black librarians who wrote this really great article about combating anti-Blackness in libraries. Ultimately, combating anti-Black structures and behaviors in libraries is not an action that can occur only when there's sufficient outrage around a particular incident. It is a grueling work that must be ongoing to be effective. And I take that to mean that don't just react when something happens. It's something that we have to continue to work towards and to put action towards instead of, only reacting when it's popular or when something happens. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and that's all that we have. In the interest of time, I think I kind of wrapped up my last slide a little bit quickly, just to give us some time and some space for questions and discussion. As Ray mentioned, this is a conversation. We welcome your comments and your questions, and we look forward to engaging with you all.
Thank you so much, Ray, Nicolette, and Patrice. I do see there is a tiny URL right there for your slide deck. We had several questions about that during your presentation, so hopefully everybody can grab that. We do have some time for questions. I'll give people a little bit of time to type those into the Q&A function, please. We will not be unmuting anybody. Also, I saw several questions too in the chat. We will be aggregating all the links that were shared, and we will be sharing them out in an email to everyone who registered, not just the people who attended, along with the recording. So you guys will have those shortly.
I just wanted to acknowledge one of the comments from Matrice Young. Says, when my father passed away, the dispatcher asked if he was turning blue. my dad and I are dark skinned, and I couldn't answer. It's like, no, blue is not a color that I turn. So yeah, some people talked about bruises and domestic violence, how that may or may not show up. So I appreciate you all for bringing those things up.
It looks like our first question came in earlier for Patrice. It may be answered later in the talk, but they wanted to ask it while Patrice was jogging their memory about the weirdness of the Mutter Museum. They would be interested in hearing if the speakers have run into any instances / resources addressing disability and ableism and how they might intersect with racism and eugenics.
Yeah, I was gonna add first that I haven't had a chance to read it, but I know read through the commentaries about it, which is Unlearning Eugenics, and I'm gonna type it in the Q&A. Unlearning Eugenics, Sexuality, Reproduction, and Disability in Post-Nazi Germany by Dr. Dagmar Herzog of the City University of New York Graduate Center, who really looks at the intersections of the mass murder of the disabled and the Holocaust of European Jewry, as well as sort of reconciliation of disability rights, as well as the systemic racism that exists during that period in Germany. I don't know if that really helps give you some ideas, perhaps gives you some directions to think about. But that's something I'll share in the chat as well as in the Q&A.
Thank you, Ray.
Yeah, I'll just say oh, no, we can go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Patrice.
Oh, no, I was just going to say very quickly that we see this all the time when we study people like J. Marion Sims, who used eugenics and white supremacy to dehumanize Black people so they could work on them without anesthesia and not feel bad about it, because they don't think that they're human or feel pain. But at the same time, they're using this to advance medicine for white people. So do you think we're human or do you think we're not? So that happens a lot. And we see that with things like XYZ runs in Black people. So heart disease and diabetes and various other diseases, or chronic illnesses and disabilities that kind of let people off the hook for not treating them properly as people. So that's kind of where I see it happening. But I know disability studies and people working in disability studies have a much better answer for you there.
Thank you both so much. Our next question is, do you have any suggestions on examples of racial science materials to search for in our own medical special collections so we can address their suitability, and impact?
Yeah, I can jump in first. Thank you, Bobby, for sharing that question, and thank you for asking that question. So in the article, we highlight also journal collections. That's something that I think were widely circulated or perused, right, as sort of a way to share best practices at the time, quote unquote, of medical practices. And now a lot of them are in special collections for understanding at the time in the 19th century how surgery or medical practices were portrayed. So I might want to encourage you to look at your these sort of serial collections that you might have: Transylvania Medical Journal, Charleston Medical Journal, the New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal. There's a lot, especially prior to the American Civil War, that universities have also produced. There's also potentially the other books that we mentioned that could highlight some of the source materials that you can look at, which you could find in the slide deck, as well as some of the titles. But I don't know if Patrice or Nicolette, if there's some other thoughts you might have on this.
Yeah, mine is more broad. So within your own organization, when you're looking through those collections, make sure you really, really look through them. If you have a de-accession or weeding policy, be sure to look into those. But also make sure your collection development policy is up to date. Look through the collection development policies over the years. And I know if you work in special collections, you're just like, LOL, we don't keep up with those over the years. I'm like, I know we didn't either, but we're working on it. And then Do you have a repatriation policy for when you do find things like human remains, when you do find like some ethical smoking guns? What is your process going to be with that? And if you need to get started on that, I know the National Museum of the American Indian has repatriation specialists. Please don't like email them and bombard their inbox or anything, but see if they have anything on the site that kind of allows you to look into some of the resources that may be available. And then what is it, NACPRA, through the Department of the Interior, Native American Graves Act, all of those, be up to date on those, because they can give you some guidance on what to do with your collections, or if you moved into a really old house that has some suspicious stuff going on, that you know what to do with any human remains that you may find. We didn't even get into things like mummification and all of that other stuff, but I'm sure like the Egyptian delegate of the world has a lot to say about how that works in museums.
I will just add, don't put this on your workers of color either. That can happen. We're often asked to take on this labor because you don't have the answers or because folks don't have the answer. And so they rely heavily on their staff of color to provide those answers. And it can really be traumatizing. So if at all, rely on consultants or these other organizations that Patrice mentioned to help out with these things, just as some guidance.
Thank you. And then I think this is maybe the most important question, and I want to acknowledge that it's coming from Twana Hodge, who's shared some very wonderful links in the chat. So thank you, Twana, for your links and all the work that you do. How do you take care of yourself while you do this work?
One thing that I did during this presentation to take care of myself was turned off the chat. So I didn't see any comments that were coming in because it just overwhelms me. But so for me, it's being in community with folks like Ray, like Patrice. This project has had its bumps in the road as we published it and things like that, but it's been so great to collaborate with them, folks who I can talk to about frustrations that I'm having or questions that I have, and really just, listening to music and just stepping away, having a good work-life balance, and being supported in my workplace to have that good work-life balance. And I'm very fortunate and grateful to have that.
Maybe I'll go next. So I think for me, when I looked at the collections that I shared that image earlier, it made me think, oh my gosh, I'm holding these collections that were once held by eugenicists people, advocates in their ways, and also colonialists, right? Colonizers. And it's just like, wow, this is just like really, it has some chilling effect, the texture of it, and just thinking about that, how it was produced and how it was handled and shared right across time. And so as Nicolette mentioned, I value our communities, even being in this circle and just sharing it as much as we can, and engage and support one another. And there's some other folks I also wanted to thank, especially Dr. Melissa Graffi from Yale School of Medicine. I remember digging up earlier during the pandemic about this and emailed her, and she wrote back right away with some good responses and thoughts. So really, this is such a great community that helps me continue doing the work with collaborators like Nicolette and Patrice.
Yeah, thank you, Ray. And I'll just add that I realized at a recent workshop that we all had to take as a unit here at the Schlesinger Library, from the Australian Society of Archivists. They have a workshop on implementing trauma-informed archival practice, and they asked the same question. And that's when I realized that, I don't know. I figured as a curator for Black collections, my job was just to absorb all day long. And then just to go home and to stare inside of the TV for hours afterwards. So that is a really, really good point. to make sure you have a plan of care. So my thing right now is to honestly come up with one, because I never really thought about having one, other than it's easier for me to check on other people than to really think about myself. It's like, why am I so cranky today? Well, it's because you've been looking at, wills with 6-year-old enslaved babies being sold. Like, that is why. So it is interesting. Thank you so much, Tawana, for that question. That workshop does cost a pretty penny. So I'm sure there are other free or more accessible trauma-informed workshops out there. Please look into it for you and for your colleagues.
Thank you, Tawana, for that question. That was a great question. Thank you.
All right, we are a little bit past the hour, so I am going to go ahead and share my screen with the CE code so that people who are looking for that can get it. Thank you so much to our presenters. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here, Ray and Patrice and Nicolette, and sharing your expertise with us today. Thank you, everyone who took the time out of your day to attend this presentation. Thank you to Tawana and everyone else who was sharing links in the chat. As I mentioned, we will share those out with everyone who registered for the webinar, along with the recording in about a week. It'll take us a little bit of time to pull those together.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the network of the National Library of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel, or select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.